Very excited today. We're joined by coaching legend, Jerry Hemmings. Thank you very much for joining us, Jerry.
Hey, thanks for having me on your show.
Fantastic. So, some people are very, very familiar with you in your career, and then some people need a little more information. So let's start with where did you grow up, and how did you kind of get involved in playing yourself?
Well, I used to tell people I'm from southern Manitoba, but with this accent, that didn't, right away I was called on that. I grew up in a small city in the kind of the northwestern area of North Carolina called Mount Airy. And now there's a famous person, and a lot of Canadians have heard of that city, but under a different name. I grew up in the hometown of Andy Griffith, which was a takeoff of Mayberry. So it's about 30 miles. I can leave my home in Mount Airy and be on Wake Forest campus in about 30 minutes. So we're right outside of Winston-Salem, North Carolina.
Fantastic. Go ahead.
We're right at the foot of the Blue Ridge Mountains. So, kind of beautiful area of North Carolina.
Absolutely. And so that's a basketball hotbed, right? You've got, Wake Forest, you've got North Carolina, you've got Duke, you got North Carolina State. It's all right there. Did that kind of formulate your love of basketball at a young age?
Most definitely. Growing up in the 60s, I started off, I was a big Duke fan. I liked Art Heyman and players that they had at Duke. Jeff Mullins was there at that time, went on and played at Golden State. And then from there, I kind of moved over to University of North Carolina. And now people ask me, said, Jerry, being from North Carolina, who do you cheer for? And I said, I cheer for North Carolina and whoever is playing Duke.
Yeah, there's a lot of people like that, I think. I think that's a common theme. So when did you get started playing basketball?
Yeah, I was a kid, probably a grade 5, grade 6. We kind of played in elementary school. And then from there, I attended a consolidated school like in the early 60s in our area. I grew up in a county called Surrey County. It's spelled a little differently than you spell Surrey in BC. We spell it down there S-U-R-R-Y. And so we had like five smaller high schools combined, and they started a new high school called North Surrey High School, which was in the northern part of the county. So that's where I attended high school from grade 9, 10, 11, and 12. And at that time, basketball in Mount Airy, for example, my senior year, we won the state 2A state championship in double overtime, beat Northwest Guilford High School out of Greensboro, North Carolina. Mount Airy High School was 3A then. They won the 3A state championship. And then I tell people that the 4A state championship was Raleigh-Broughton High School out of Raleigh, North Carolina. And their star player was Pistol Pete Maravich. Pistol Pete and I graduated in high school in the same year.
Wow. What was it like seeing him play? And did you get a chance to compete against him?
No, they were a bigger high school, so they played at a different level. And at that time, his father, Press Maravich, coached North Carolina State University. And then at the end of Pete's senior year, then that's when Press took the head coaching job at LSU. And then, rest of it is, Pistol Pete going on there and basically averaging 40-some points a game. So, like probably the only thing bigger than basketball, and sometimes a lot of people say basketball is probably bigger than religion in North Carolina, and religion, believe me, is very big there.
Yeah, absolutely. So you end up having a good high school career. Your team wins a championship, so you got to be pretty happy about that. You go on to play college, university. Where'd you go, and what took you there?
Well, I ended up. We got to look back when we talk about the late 60s. A lot of your big schools were not really integrated then. Like Charlie Scott was the first black player to play at University of North Carolina, and I think he started there maybe in 1966. And so a lot of your tough basketball schools back then, everybody thinks, of Wake Forest, North Carolina, Duke, etc. But a lot of you great black basketball players played at predominantly all all black schools or basically played at NAIA schools, something that, you know, Simon Fraser used to play at one time, and then in Lakehead University. And I'll kind of get into that later because I ended up at Lakehead University, and that's how I first ended up in Canada. So, you know, we had places like Guilford College, High Point College, Western Carolina University, and a lot of their best players were black players because they didn't get those opportunities back then to play at University of Kentucky, Mississippi, LSU. If you ever go back and look at old video, predominantly all those teams were white. So it was tough basketball, and so I basically ended up playing at a junior college, and then my second year, I was a second leading scorer in the state of North Carolina. I averaged over 29 points a game, and I was actually considering going to a school down in right outside Atlanta, Georgia, and I'd gone down for a visit and was considering there. And then what happened was George Berger, who was an American from South Dakota, had been hired, I believe, in 1966 or 67. He was hired as athletic director, head basketball coach at Lakehead University in Thunder Bay, Ontario, which then was basically Port Arthur, Fort William. And so he contacted my junior college coach, and we started discussions from there. And growing up in North Carolina in Mount Airy, we also have a large granite quarry. And my dad was a granite cutter. He worked on the quarry ever since he was 12 years old. He only had a grade 3 education, and I was the youngest of 9 children. And as a small child, my mom and dad, when the work was not good in North Carolina, he would go up to Vermont and work in the quarry there, and then they would travel over to maybe short trips, a weekend going over to Montreal. So I'd kind of heard of Canada, and basically growing up in the late 60s in the South, you know, the only 2 cities that I was familiar with in Canada, and that was Montreal and Toronto. And I never heard of Vancouver. I never heard of Calgary. Never heard of Port Arthur, Fort William. So I kind of looked at it was, you know, this is a great opportunity to go somewhere, you know, through the game of basketball that otherwise I may never happen. So I ended up going on a scholarship to Lakehead, and at that time we played out of District 13, and where we played schools out of Minnesota and Wisconsin. And we had a really good team there. We won 23 games and lost 2 that year, and we lost in the finals of the NAIA District 13 championships in Minneapolis to go to Kansas City, where the NAIA basketball championships were hosted every year. And later I'd gone there when I was coaching Brandon. I'd gone there a few times just to see the tournament, and wow, what a tournament. You have 32 regions throughout the United States, and they start playing on Monday. And if you love basketball, you know, it was a mecca place to be, because you had 8 games on Monday, you had 8 games on Tuesday, 8 games on Wednesday, and finally Saturday night you had the championship. So basically, through basketball is starting off as a player, you know, being recruited to play at Lakehead University. And like I said, I played there 2 years. And then by playing in the U.S. and playing out of the NAIA, you only had 4 years of eligibility. And I played 2 years of JUCO ball and then 2 years at Lakehead. And what had happened was another player on the team, Joe Parks, who was from Alexandria, Virginia. George Berger, who was from South Dakota, was a good friend with Gary Howard, who was coaching the Brandon Bobcats at that time. I think Gary was hired in 1969. And so George and Gary wanted us to come out here and play our 5th year, because Lakehead was still going to be in the NAIA for 2 more years before they were going into the Canadian League. At that time, I was only one course short of having my degree done. So I came to Brandon as a visiting student and played here in 1971, 72. And then what I did, I transferred my courses back to Lakehead and got my degree from Lakehead.
Okay, so let's go back a little bit. So you get to Lakehead. Big difference between Lakehead and North Carolina. You've got to be a culture shock, right? What's going through your head when you get to Canada?
Well, well, I came there in the fall of the year, so it was, the weather was nice, and we had a nice facility. We played out. The people were really warm. We had, we had great spectators back then. Because one of the things was that the drinking age then was like 21. So all of these kids, 18, 19, 20, it was a huge social activity to come out to the basketball games. And plus, we won 20 games in a row before we ever lost. So we had a really good following. And then, the winter comes, and then I realized where the saying comes that some areas are like Manitoba and Northwestern Ontario. It's like 10 months wintertime and 2 months bad skating, because now you're in hockey country.
Right.
But I enjoyed my time there, and it was definitely. I used to live in a hotel there. They had some housing for some players, and I lived in one hotel and another player from Texas. Because I think on that team we had 6 or 7 Americans on that team, and. But I remember used to look out and it'd be bright and sunny. And I thought, wow, it's going to be a gorgeous day out there, until I got outside, because I had maybe about a mile to go to campus. And it was easy to get rides back then. If you had some school books and you walk out on the street and stick your thumb out, somebody picked you up within about 5 minutes. But then I'd get out there and, wow, I never realized how cold it was. Because when it was clear in the wintertime and cold, it was like it looked beautifully, but it was really, really cold. It may be 20, 25 below zero. So I'd always have to go back in and dress a little bit better. But, but it was fun times back then. When you're 20 years old, you can handle anything.
Yeah, absolutely. So you get your taste of Brandon. So you play there for a year. What was your experience like at Brandon when you were playing?
Well, it was a different experience from the fact that we had a lot better players at Lakehead, and we were, it was a tougher schedule. And the year that I came, Gary Howard had recruited a lot of American kids out of high school. And people don't realize this. When I started coaching here in 1974, there was an import rule that you could only have 3. Well, the year in 71, 72 that I played here, I was one of 11 Americans on the team.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, and, he had 11 guys. Some guys had a little bit of experience. A lot of them were out of high school. But personally, I had a good year. I led the Great Plains in scoring. I averaged about 24.5 points a game and was unanimous first team conference all-star, and made honorable mention All-Canadian. But then we had a guy from Bob Lacey, who played at University of Saskatchewan, was the first team All-Canadian, and Bob Town from Manitoba was the second team All-Canadian. I was honorable mention, but like I told kids later in coaching, you can't expect to be a first team all-star or make an all-Canadian team if you play on a bad team. And our record that year was 3 wins and 13 losses. And meanwhile, when I came from Lakehead, our first year we won 23, lost 2. And my second year we were 21-9. And then, to come to Brandon and you never want to go out as a player on a losing record.
No, so you end up playing. You finish your career there. What did you graduate with, and then what happened next?
Yeah, I got my degree from Lakehead, and I had a double major in physical education and economics. So I went back to Lakehead in 72, 73, and I did my education degree. and I did that in phys ed and guidance counseling. And then after that year, I had a chance to go over to France. So I went over to France and played in 1973-74. And then what happened, I come back, and then Gary Howard, kind of the late summer, maybe kind of early August, in Canada, they don't hire coaches right away like they do in the States. There's about 2 or 3 months where they got no one coaching. And at age 26, I got hired in August of 1974 as the head basketball coach at Brandon University.
So you got the job. What was that like to get the job? And so you had no coaching experience when you got the Brandon job? It was just straight up like.
Well, actually, when I was at Lakehead 72-73, I worked as assistant coach to Howard Lockhart, and that was their second year. Now I'm going to say, no, it was been their first year in the Canadian League, and we had a good team. Unfortunately, we ended up losing to St. Mary's University in the national championship game.
Okay.
And I'll tell you what helped me get the job in Brandon, and in hindsight, was the fact that I played here. I had a good year, but then I was gone. Sometimes, you have to be somewhere and then leave to maybe have that opportunity to come back. And the fact, I think at that time being an American probably helped me because of the fact that to be successful in a smaller university, the backbone becomes your recruiting. You have to become a good recruiter to attract players. And I think at that time, Brandon was in the early 70s. They were using some American players, and I think they thought probably I was the best candidate of all the people that applied that maybe could do that.
Absolutely. So now when you get in there, the team's, not winning. What's the first thing that you say to yourself, okay, I got to put my imprint on this thing. We got to change a few things. What were some of the things that you said, okay, listen, we're not doing that anymore. We're doing this now?
Well, I know the first thing I did when I got hired here, actually Joe Parks, who had come here with me from Lakehead, he was still here because he had transferred to Brandon and was doing his degree and then was doing an education degree. I wanted to just become more visible. For the first thing I did was I think I bought something like 300 basketball nets, and I had them painted blue and gold. And Joe and I took a ladder and we went around everywhere there was in the city, and we asked, could we take their old net down and put one of those blue and gold nets up? So I wanted to kind of get people thinking that, that we want to kind of turn this around. And it was tough the first couple of years because when I started in 74, our budget was very small. We played out of the Great Plains Athletic Conference, which, back then you traveled to games in vans. You didn't have. I had no telephone budget, and my early recruiting was putting letters together, a form letter talking about Brandon University, talking about the schedule, et cetera, the degree programs, and then I didn't close the questionnaire. And the first question that I asked on the questionnaire: would you be interested in attending Brandon University? So now if the athlete sent back a yes, then I went after that kid. If I never heard back, and then, and basically what happens a lot of times, the best athletes, they may be interested in your school, but they never get around to completing the form. So at the beginning, I basically recruited a lot of kids that basically wanted to come here, probably number one, because they wanted to play basketball. They looked at it as an opportunity to play. However, we didn't get a lot of the real top players. And then that kind of changed in 78. I was fortunate that George Berger, who I had played for at Lakehead, we had a hockey coach that was an athletic director, and he decided to move on. And George had left Lakehead in I want to say about 1973, and he became a general manager of the Tucson Mavericks hockey team. So he went there for a few years, and then the team, for whatever reason, I believe they folded, and then he got hired as the head coach at Prince Edward Island University, which would have been back in 77, 78. So he was there a year, and then the job opened here. So I was on the phone right away to George, because George was a guy that he was very committed to having a very good program, and he was also an excellent recruiter. So I know when he first came here, he said, Jerry, one thing we got to do, we really got to upgrade our recruiting. So all of a sudden he started giving me a phone budget and putting some money into recruiting, and then I became very active as a recruiter, and probably for the next 20 years was probably considered one of the top basketball recruiters in any Canadian university.
Right. And so to get kids to go to Brandon, one of the things with your questionnaire, I got a couple of friends who are coaches, and they put together the questionnaire, and they don't like kids' answers. And my thing is, well, then stop asking that question. Like, if you don't like the answers you're getting, you're asking the wrong questions. So, what made you change it so that now you're saying, okay, I got some groove now, I can start making some moves?
Yeah. Well, at 78, 79, we had a good team. We ended up losing in the first round of the playoffs to Lakehead University. And then we came back. I brought a kid in actually in January that year to not play, but to kind of work with me to have him here for the next year. And his name was Fred Lee. And then 79, 80, Fred, and we had Jerry Abernathy, a big 6'10" player from New York that basically was a 3-time All-Canadian with us, and tremendous shot blocker and rebounder. And Fred Lee that year became a first-team All-Canadian. We brought Jude Kelly in, who had transferred from Prince Edward Island. George also brought with him a 6'7" player, Keith Streeter, who was about 6'7", 230, 235, a big power forward. So we went on that year, and we won the Great Plains Athletic Conference. We went undefeated, 16-0. We swept Winnipeg in the playoffs, and then we went to the national championships. And then that was in Calgary in 1980. We had a heck of a first-round game where we're down to York University with like 3.5 minutes to go in the game, and pulled it out by beating them 91-90. And then we had to play Winnipeg, now who we played something like 8 times that year. So you can imagine the rivalry and the competition. And we beat them in a tough game. I think it ended up being like 85-81. And then and we had to play the late game. So now the Saturday national championship game was all based on, I want to say CTV, whoever broadcasted the game nationally back then, was basically what's the best time for people back in Ontario to win the game. To watch the game. So that was 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So we got back to our hotel. We had to play a 9 o'clock game on Friday night. We got back to the hotel 11:30, midnight, something, quite late. Now we had to turn around and play at 11 a.m. in the morning. And we played Ken Shields and the University of Victoria Vikings, and we were up 1 at the half, and they ended up beating us about 6 points in the national championship game. And I think, with the circumstances, it would have been nice to have a little bit more recovery time, but that's just the way it goes. So basically now, I remember at that time I had professors saying, "Oh, Jerry, boy, national TV, this and that. Boy, everybody want to come to Brandon now." And but I knew what I had to do. I had to parlay that success that we had as a team into recruiting. And so I'd made some trips down in Southern Ontario, and probably that's when I really started, developing a network of recruiting a lot of good players that over the next 20 years. Because I'd always tell people that, Americans help us be competitive. We've always had a difficult time keeping, especially during that era of time, keeping the big Canadians in Canada. At that time, that's what the American schools were going after. They were looking for the Mike Smirks and Greg Wilchers, these big 6'10", 6'11", 7-footers. And meanwhile, we had to basically kind of look to the States to find, bigger players. So I think they helped us get competitive, but being able to recruit a lot of good Canadian players, I think really became the framework to help us, be one of the best basketball team probably from 1980 up until I left BU, which was around 2004. And then I know you interviewed Danny there, and although I didn't recruit Danny, but I had recruited a couple kids, Joel, Michelle, before I left Brandon, and then Joel became like 2-time defensive player of the year in the country. So, because a lot of people probably don't remember now, but the Brandon Bobcats from like 87, we went to the national championship 16 years in a row. So that's pretty good for a little.
So let's get to the 16 years in a row in a second, but I want to go back to that national final. So you obviously, you must have felt like you had some unfinished business, because you got to the final. You probably were like, we just needed a little bit of rest. We could have won this game. You're going up against a dynasty that's coming out of UVic. There's a whole bunch of things, and you're like, listen, we're one player away from making this happen. I got to believe is what you're thinking. What's the process to take it to the next level now? What do we got to do? You're going to Ontario, you just mentioned, to go find some more kids and create a network. But who kind of put you over the top to take you to the next level?
Well, I really think our foundation was really Jerry Abernathy, our 6'10" player that actually started with us in 77, 78. We kind of built on him, and basically I kind of looked at, I'm going to build this team from the inside outside. Today people look at it a lot differently, and they'd probably say, we're going to, build it with great 3-point shooters because the way the game is played today. So, but my thing was that, you need that good big man to anchor things inside that. And Ab was a great one with that because he was a great rebounder. He averaged over 16 rebounds a game. He averaged 8, 9 block shots. And then next was the point guard, because you're only going to be as good as your point guard is. I used to say you can take a good point guard and put a poor big man with him. That big man's going to get better. But if you take a poor point guard, well, that big man isn't going to get better. So the point guard was really big, and like I said, we had Fred Lee there, and then we recruited Earl Roberts, who was probably Earl played with us from 81 to 86, 5 years, and at that time probably never got the recognition that he deserved, and even Ken Shields says that to the day, because basically at that time was Eli Pasquale and Victoria having their string of 7 wins, and we played with Vic. I'm looking back at a lot of the exhibition games we played during the 80s, and we probably beat Victoria a lot more than they beat us. But then they beat us in the national championship in 80. They beat us again in 83, and then fortunately in Ken Shields' last game as a university coach in 89, we beat them that game. So we got a little bit of redemption there. But during the 80s, Victoria and Brandon won every national championship. We were definitely, 2 of the strongest university teams during that period of time.
No, and I mean, the stories are legendary. I mean, just listening to people talk about those times. I mean, you had high level basketball, and you got after it. Now, so you mentioned a lot about your recruiting, but let's talk coaching philosophy. Well, what type of coach were you on the court? Were you trying to? You did mention that you want to go inside and then work your way outside, but what was kind of the philosophy of what you were trying to achieve while you were doing it?
Well, I really look at, and some of the coaches across Canada, people always kind of looked at the Brandon Bobcats as a running gun team, but that wasn't the case. I think, their association sometimes during the 80s, 70s, and 80s was that teams that had, black players being American or Canadian, that's the style of ball that they played, and which wasn't the case. My philosophy was basically, if I've got good athletes, we really want to try to speed the game up. And we want to really speed it up from a defensive perspective. And that is, we want to press. And then that's either full court man-to-man, or if we press 1-2-1-1. And a lot of people, they may press, and then once they give up a basket or two, now they want to come out of the press. Well, I looked at it differently. I looked at it, if we give up a basket or two, that's okay, because we want to keep that tempo up there. And especially later in my career, when you had a lot more three-point shooters and things, those three-point shooters, their legs die in the last 5 minutes of a game. And that's when they may have made some of those shots in the first half, but now they start short rimming it, and because fatigue sets in. And then offensively, hey, we'd like to transition the ball if we had advantages that our defense gave us, and that was either off the press or either off the half-court game, if, we could make steals and get opportunities. But other than that, we really executed well. I know one of the biggest compliments that are received after we beat Acadia in the '88 National Championship game in Halifax, where you're going to have 10,000 fans, and you're going to have probably cheering for the Brandon Bobcats. You're going to probably count the fans on one hand because you're in that type of atmosphere. But I know after the game and we won, Ken Shields came up to me and said, "Jerry, without a doubt, that's the best offensive execution I've ever seen in a national championship game." And at that time, and then even the 90s, I was a coach that I kind of controlled where guys would get the shots. If you can't shoot the three-point shot, well, you're not going to shoot it. But if you're a good guy that can flash and we can get the ball to you one-on-one in the key. So probably for the last 10 years, my team's average field goal percentage, something like 53% from the floor.
Wow.
And today, you look at some of these stats and you look at them at the end of the year because, there's a lot of shots are not necessarily good shots. And you'll see a lot of times I check things out and your team may shoot 25% from the three-point line. They may shoot 32, 33% from the field. But then the style of game they're playing, right, is to spread the court, and we want to get a three, we want to shoot threes, or either we want to get to the hole and get a layup. If I was defensing against these guys today, if you can control penetration and make them shoot off the dribble, because a lot of teams today, they don't even practice shooting off the dribble. One dribble, two dribbles, or pulling up in the lane. They'll get into the lane. If they don't have it, they'll jump up in the air and turn sideways and throw the ball outside to shoot another three. So, it's a different philosophy. But we got those high percentage shots because we drilled those areas, but we also put the players in where they could do well. I'm not going to let a guy that can't shoot the three, get out there and shoot threes because the fans like to see three-point shots being taken.
Fans don't really like them being taken. They like them being made. I tell people that all the time. The only difference between you and me and Steph Curry is that we can take the same shots, but he hits them. And so,
yeah.
you know, realistically, if you want to step back from 40 feet and jack it, if it goes in, I'll leave you alone. But if the ball's not going in, we got a problem. So,
I
yeah.
I go see Winnipeg and Brandon if they're in town playing, and Gil Chung played for me. Mike Rainbow coaches Winnipeg, one of my former players. And, you know, it's not unusual that each team's going to shoot 35 to 43s a game, you know, and not necessarily they make a high percentage, but that's, you know, that's, I think the NBA and them spreading the court and, you know, it just became how the game's being played.
So now, did you have somebody that you looked up to as a coach? Were there people that you kind of tried to formulate your coaching philosophy after, or that you looked up to, or that you went to coaching clinics with?
Yeah, I went to a lot of coaching clinics over the years, and I think the biggest thing about going to coaching clinics is an opportunity to, you know, to get ideas, but more importantly, would confirm to you that basically what I'm doing is solid. You know, you got to look at what your philosophy, and I look in over the years, you know, you got to have a sound philosophy of how you're going to play defensively, how you're going to play offensively. Then you know, you got to be committed to the drill work, you know, the part method of putting those things together to go into the whole thing, which is your offense and defense. And I really look at three of the most successful coaches probably in Canada West over the last 30 years was Ken Shields, myself, and probably Don Horwood at Alberta, because we had a system of play. We just didn't, you know, just go out and basically do anything or basically change from year to year. You know, we would take that philosophy of how we like to play, and then we recruited the pieces that would fit into that. And, you know, we played different teams over the years, and, you know, they may have a different offense from one week to the next week. And I think now one of the most successful is probably Kevin Hansen at UBC. And, you know, he has a style of play that he wants to play. He's always been a transition. Let's get it down to the sideline and, you know, and get the ball down and see if we can get, you know, good early shots. And meanwhile, I always look at it, you know, from an offensive perspective. We can get those easy shots, great. But more importantly, on the defensive end, we don't want to give up those easy shots. We don't want to give up layups. And
absolutely. So one of the things you mentioned is you've had a couple of players that have decided to go coach. Obviously, you've been coaching for a long time, so you have some in the CIS. I'm assuming a ton of guys have come back to you when they're coaching their own kids and saying, hey, I'm coaching my own kid. I remember some of the stuff we used to do. What's it like seeing some of your former players go out and actually become coaches themselves?
Well, I think that's a real a great feeling, you know, is to have these guys to basically go on. I think it shows that that was a good recruit you made. He committed himself. He got better as a player, not only technically, but he started understanding the game tactically, and he was motivated by playing on winning teams. You know, it brought about that winning attitude within that coach. And, you know, we've had a lot of guys go on. Like I said, we got Gil Chung, who I'd recruited here out of Vancouver back in 1999, played 4 years. He played for Kevin Hansen 1 year before that at Langara. You know, he's a good basketball mind. He hasn't had the great success yet. And I think a lot of that's the fact that, you know, it just kind of revolving door of players, you know. And I used to tell people, you know, you expend a lot of energy, a lot of time in getting these kids developed, you know, in the first and second year. And you got to really keep them going academically, because when they're going to really help you is basically in their third, fourth, and fifth year. You know, I use the example a lot of times. It's like money. If I've got money, I want to invest it well. You know, I don't want to put it in a bad investment and a year or two later I don't have anything, because you put a lot of time and energy with players. So then you got to make sure that you get kids that academics is important, And sometimes, especially a school like Brandon, and I'd say probably a majority of schools, that a lot of these kids come in as athlete students. They see themselves as an athlete first and a student second, and it takes about 2 or 3 years to kind of flip that around. And before they start seeing themselves that, hey, I've got this many credit hours, I'm only this many credit hours of graduating. And, you know, and I just don't think the maturity of boys, it happens as early as girls. You know, I think at 19, 20, 21, 22, you know, so you got to get them up to that point, and that's you know, staying on top of them, making sure they're getting their work done, and sometimes that's you know, it's always a tough part of the job. It's an important part of the job, and I feel so fortunate over the years that I coached so many players that played 5 years. You know, and because we went in 87, 88, 89. We won 3 national championships, but we had a strong core of players. We had John Carson, who is, I don't know if you remember the name John Carson, but John Carson played for me from 82 through 87. He's the only player in the history of university basketball that was a 5-time first-team All-Canadian. And so we had a, you know, we talked about, you know, getting some key players that you build around. And Earl Roberts, our point guard, played for us 5 years. I had Patrick Jebbison out of Toronto, that was 2-time National Player of the Year in 88 and 89, played 5 years. We had a lot of kids that played. And because, you have kids in a year or two, they adjust into the league, they adjust into university life, et cetera, et cetera. But when you get them in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th year now you got a situation, they know what it's like. You know,
well, standards are there, right? Whatever your standards are, they know what they are, and they know,
yeah.
You know when they got to come to practice. They know what they got to do outside of practice. They understand what schoolwork is like. I think that's
right.
totally true. I see it all the time. And you know what? You know, we got our business here, and the people that have been here long enough, they know what the standards are, and they can execute it. And if you got to keep training people about standards and all that stuff, it really gets in the way of your success, because you're spending time, instead of trying to excel, you're spending time trying to train, and it gets in the way of success for sure.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you know, let's face it, a successful business is no different than a successful team. You know, you have to have a plan. I know I always operated under a little acronym, was WIN, W-I-N. And every day I'd start my morning, what's important now? What do we have to work on today in practice? You know, what do we got to do? So that was a little guiding thing for me. But getting back to one thing you mentioned earlier was what coach had an impact on me. And growing up in North Carolina in the 60s, we had a small college, okay, called Davison College, okay? Now, first thing you do, you had a smile come on your face, because now you associate Davison College with what player?
Well, I'm doing Bob McKillop and then Steph Curry for sure.
Steph Curry, right. But at that time, Davison College in the 60s was about 1,000 people, coached by a legendary coach by the name of Lefty Driesell, who later went on to Maryland. And Lefty Driesell, and at that time, Davison, to get into Davison in probably in the 60s, you got to realize academic requirements are so different today than back then. There was a high emphasis on academic requirements of admission back in the 60s. And they're a school about 1,000 students, and I think the SAT scores in to get in was about 1,200. And one of the great players he brought in, I had an opportunity to meet him because I coached over in Austria back in the early 2000s, was a guy by the name of Mike Malloy. Mike Malloy was a 6'8" guy from New York City that came to Davison, and in the late 60s was a first-team All-American. And he was drafted by the Boston Celtics, ended up not going into NBA, ended up going over to Austria and signing a big deal over there. and actually ended up spending his life there. And unfortunately, we lost him about 7 to 8 years ago. They had that bad flu that went through Europe. He contracted the flu and died at something like 54, 55 years old, early 50s. So anyhow, I had a chance to visit with him over there. And now you hear with, everything happening in the States now, and then the death of the Congressman John Lewis here just over the last few days, that Mike Malloy told me he was part of being recruited to Davison because he was kind of an activist. He was a great player, but he was also, there was a period of time of civil rights, and that was part of his mission going to Davison. So anyhow, so some of our philosophy came out of it, because at that time, Davison was beating schools like North Carolina. They were defeating Duke, and then that's when I kind of coined the phrase at Brandon: because you're small doesn't mean you can't be the best. And that means, we only have 3,000 students, but the rules, pretty well limit us that you can only have 12 players on your team. You only have 5 on the court at one time.
Right. And
you got to sell your advantages, and our advantages was small school. I tell kids, hey, I'm not asking you to move away from Toronto. I'm not asking you to move away from New Orleans. What I'm asking you to do is come here, get your degree, then you can go back there. So I kind of coined that phrase, because you're small doesn't mean you can't be the best. And it was all about not the size of the player, but the size of the school. And we kind of really instilled that in our players. And and our guys really accepted the challenge, because when you're on the top of the mountain and you're one of the top teams, whoever you play, you bring the best out of them. They're always going to play their best basketball against you, so you have to be ready to play every game. But for us, it starts Monday in practice. Hey, I've had many players over the years said our practices were tougher than the games, because we had a lot of competitive players.
Well, so you lose the national final. You finally you win a couple of years later. What's that like to know that the work you put in was validated on the court? You were obviously seeing some success off the court. You're seeing improvement, obviously, but then to make the big jump and actually get it done, that had to be pretty satisfying.
Yeah, it is special. I mean, it's just, the instant gratification it brings you after winning. However, I tell people, I've been on the other side. We lost the national championship in 80. 2000, we ended up losing a real tough game against X in the national championship game when Randy Knorr hit a winning shot to beat us. We lost in 2001 to X again. I'm talking about, again, when you got 11,500 people, you in some ways you win. But really, those losses, those are the tough ones to get over. I think our psyche is that we like winning. We expect them win. But, overcoming those losses, or, if we could have made this play, or if I would have maybe done this. And I think any coach, to become successful, I think it starts by you looking at yourself. What do you have to do better as a coach to help your team win? And, sometimes you'll see a lot of coaches, they'll point at the players first, but hey, as a coach, could I change that defense? Hey, maybe we should have ran this. Maybe we switched up a number of different things. And I think as a coach, you got to look and say, hey, I have a responsibility here too to get us into the winner's circle.
Well, the other thing is as a university coach, you pick the players. So if the players aren't any good, there's only one guy to blame. It's not them, it's you. You're the one who picked them. So realistically, you got to find the right people, and you got to invest in getting your research done. What did you do to go about narrowing down and make sure that people were the right people when you were there?
Well, that's a difficult part in Canada. because you don't have all the opportunities that coaches have in the States in terms of recruiting. You know, we never had kids to come in and visit. We had no budgets for it. What I would have to do, I made video highlight tapes. I remember in the early 80s, I did All-Canadian brochures. Because all Canadians are picked by the coaches. So I would put together, you know, basically what Hemmings has to say about the player, maybe what opposing coaches had to say, their stats and everything, to get our kids recognition. Then scheduling was a big part. If I had a choice of going to Toronto, where I could play in the York University tournament or Ryerson tournament, over going to University of Winnipeg, well, I'm going to Toronto because why? That's where I recruit. I want their families to be able to come out and see them play, their friends, etc. In the 80s, I scheduled a lot of NCAA 1 schools. We played Iowa State, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Kansas State, University of Jacksonville, South Florida, you know, because I was trying to simulate, boy, if we get to Halifax, hey, we're used to playing in a big time environment where you're going to have 8,000 to 10,000 fans. So, but then a lot of times and then you got to get those guys together. And I think that's where I was pretty good. And I think a lot of people recognize the fact that I could take kids from many different socioeconomic backgrounds and bring them together as a team. And sometimes that takes patience, but eventually over a period of time, you know, those players gel. And as a coach, you know, you got to have those short-term goals, long-term goals, and they have to be willing to, you know, accept a role. And that's always one of the toughest things in coaching basketball is, especially a university coach, because everybody recruiting is a good player in high school. But now they have to come in and they have to make adjustments to their game.
Sure.
And I always look at –
Go ahead.
No,
go ahead.
I had a kid, Marvin Russell, I recruited out of Toronto, George Harvey High School, was a great player. He's 6'2", jump out of the gym, score, could do it all. But when he came with the Brandon Bobcats, all of a sudden he became not a big scorer for us. He became our defensive stopper. So here's a kid that had to change his game of averaging 20 points a game to now maybe getting 8 to 10 points, but he's got to stop. You know, he's got to stop these other guys' best scorers. Because when you look at the 80s, 90s, you know, a lot of your best scorers were perimeter players. You know, because again, Canada didn't have, you know, we didn't have a lot of really 6'8", 6'9", 6'10" dominant players. You know, if you go back and look at all Canadian teams, you'll see a lot of them were guards or, you know, forwards, you know, maybe 6'4", 6'5". So, you know, so you have to have somebody in putting a game plan together to win. You know, you gotta recruit players that's not necessarily, if they are a really good top player, then you got to convince them they got to change their game. Or sometimes you got to go out and recruit players that will get in the trenches. And I'll give you an example of that. The Premier of Manitoba now, Brian Paliser, is one of my former players. He's 6'8". When I recruited Brian, he was like about 270 pounds. And the biggest thing I did, I had to get him in shape. And I used to run him till his tongue hung out. And he would leave the gym and he'd go out, and I'd tell him, I'd put in every corner of the gym, I put one of those little metal garbage cans. And I said, hey, if you get sick, you're out of shape. You're gonna get sick here. Your stomach's gonna, you know, it's gonna come up into your throat. And I said, just pick up one of those garbage cans and just puke, but keep running. And many times he'd go out the side door and he'd go out and he'd be sick. Hey, within a couple of months, we got him down to 235 pounds. And to his credit, if you ever see pictures of him, he's 6'8" now, and he's probably about 225. He's been able to keep that weight down. But he was a guy that got into the trenches. Tough rebounder.
You know what? I was talking to somebody about this the other day, and every year there's about probably 7-8 teams that can win a national championship. But the teams that win are the guys who's got somebody a little grit to them, got some dog in them, somebody who wants to go into the trenches and duke it out and fight it out. And once you get to the tournament, anybody can win the tournament. It's a matter of, can you put together 3 days to take care of business and grind it out. Well, a lot of teams don't need more talent. They probably have enough talent. There's quite a few. But do you have somebody who's going to make that play when they need to make it? Do you have somebody who can grind out that win? Who would you say in your career was probably one of the top, clutch, big time performers that you had?
Well, I'd have to say probably, John Carson. When we won in '87, we beat UBC. Bruce Ems was coaching UBC at that time, and Carson stepped up in the championship game. He hadn't played all that great in the first 2 rounds, but then all of a sudden he scored 39 points in that final game. But I had other kids, Joey Vickery, who you may have heard of. Joey used to play with us on the national team for years, and we won in '79. We beat 89. We beat Victoria by 1. I mean, he has a huge game, makes big shots. And here was a kid 5'10", and he was always one of those kids, which is a real inspiration to players. Was that when he was in high school, he was the youngest of something like 5 brothers, and everybody said basically Joey's on the team because his brothers played on the team, and that motivated him. And all of a sudden, he became the best high school player in Manitoba. And people said Joey's too small. He's 145 pounds, 5'10". Never be able to play university. Well, he goes on and plays university, and he becomes a 3-time All-Canadian. Led us to national championship in '89, and then all of a sudden makes the Canadian national team. I worked with Ken Shields from '89 to '94. I was kind of his lead assistant, and the World Championship in Argentina in '90, and then '94 in Toronto, and then I coached our World University team in '91. So I had some great experience. Our World University team, '91, Joey was on that team. I had Tommy Johnson, Spencer McKay, and I can tell you a good Spencer McKay story. But we, in the semifinals, we had to play the Soviet Union, and we beat them. We beat them 74-71. So a little bit of trivia: we're the last team that beat the Soviet Union in international basketball. That was July the 23rd, 1991. And the reason I say that, because 10 days later they folded as a country. So we beat them there. But I can remember Spencer hit some huge free throws because Ken Shields used to really get on him. He missed really, bear down, Spence, bear down. And all of a sudden that became almost like a mental block to Spencer. Well, my approach was a little bit bigger. Hey, see the big basket. And he had a couple of big free throws for us. And I remember the Soviets called timeout, and he came over, and his eyes was big as saucers because, that here he just it was basically an average free throw shooter, but boy, in probably the biggest game that he ever played on an international stage, and he just hit something like 4 free throws in a row to basically win that basketball game for us.
Unreal. Spencer is an unbelievable player. Now, do you have 1 or 2 other, memories that you thought were tremendous that people would like to hear?
Well, you know what? I was in 2003-04. I went to Syria. A lot of people probably don't know that, but I coached Ittihad in Aleppo, Syria. Aleppo, Syria is the oldest city in the world, and it was about 4.5 million people. And I coached the largest Muslim team there, and that was a great experience. That was all before the problems they started having in 2009. Although it was a was a dictator. Assad was a dictator and still is in Syria. But I coached a guy by the name of Mohammed Abdul Sada. And his name at that time in the Middle East was as big as Michael Jordan was. And just the experience of coaching in, because basically, in Canada, our fans are very passive. They don't really get into it. But you get in the Middle East where you got a field house that seats around 5,000, and basically they're all male. The females don't get in. They're basically all poor, and you win big games over there. It's but the fans really get into it, and God, you can turn around and see they don't let the security or the police over there have guns, but they got bully sticks and boom, it was unbelievable from that perspective. When we had a good team, and I coached a couple good. I had Tony Rutland was my point guard who played with Tim Duncan at Wake Forest University, and then I had another kid, Mo Baker, who had played at Oklahoma State, and after his junior year was the recipient of the Player of the Year in which is now the Big 12, and who was a nominee for the John Wooten Award. So I had, and it was kind of different over there, and I think it could be a good rule to help develop basketball in Canada. And we could only have 2 imports, but you could only have 1 on the court at a time. So now you really had to look at, well, do I have 1 big man and 1 guard? Do I go with 1 guard and the score? So you got to really look at what you have on your team. And then I know in my situation, my second player, I took another point guard, because I kind of look, if we lost Tony Rutland, I had a lot of 6'7", 6'8" guys. It goes back to what I said earlier, you're only as good as your point guard. And I thought, well, boy, if Tony Rutland gets hurt here, I don't really want to use a Syrian point guard. So I kind of picked up Mo Baker there. So that was a good experience at that time.
Unbelievable. On a personal note, obviously, Danny Charlery works with me. He's a great guy. He loves talking about you. Give me a Danny Charlery story from my own personal vault. I need something. Give me a good Danny Charlery story of what, maybe when you saw him and you were like, this guy's got it. What do you got for me?
Well, I kind of think maybe Danny getting here, that really helped was the fact that I had recruited some of these other kids like Ewell Magell, and I had Mario. I'm trying to think of Mario's name right now. Mario Joseph, who's now the head coach at University of Montreal, and I think he said, I'd watched the interview you did with him, and then he went to Barnaby Craddock came there and had heard about him, etc. But Danny, what I liked about Danny was I think he'd be great in the game today, although his game probably doesn't fit how a lot of these coaches play today, and that shoot the 3. Because Danny was great at getting the spots on the court and hitting his jump shots. He was good, and I think he got better as a defensive player as he got older. And I know he's kind of disappointed because they didn't do that well in the last couple of years. And listened to the interview there, and I think a lot of players. I thought one of my missions as a head coach was, if my players were good players and they graduated, that was my conditions. You've got to establish yourself as a great player. You get your degree done. Then my job as a coach is to work for you to get you a professional playing job. And I developed contacts over the years, and different agents and knew basically. And I think maybe Danny there maybe didn't get those opportunities at the end because it takes that coach really working for you. It's really difficult to do it as a player yourself? Okay.
My wife just handed me the baby.
Oh,
Yeah, no.
Big boy.
He's already got his jump man. He's ready to go.
Yeah.
This,
So, yeah, good looking.
Danny's his idol.
What's he, about 6 months old?
Still on, you're good. No, I agree with you. Danny was he would have been great at the next level, and I'm great. 1 second, just chill out. It's okay. Danny would have been great at the next level, and his stuff would have been fantastic. But
yeah, just and I just think that's probably unfortunate. And I looked at it, as boy, if you can get these guys that dedicate themselves to you anywhere from 3 to 5 years, depending on if they're transferred, if they used eligibility before. They've helped you. They've helped the school. Now your job, because I kind of look back at it. When I graduated from high school, I played on the state high school championship team. I didn't think my high school coach really worked for me like he should have. And sometimes you'll get coaches, once that eligibility is exhausted, that's it. They got bigger fish to fry, and that's recruiting somebody else. And I just think as a university coach, you have a real commitment to do what you can. If those guys if they're good enough to play, and I definitely think Danny was one of those. And I had a lot of players that asked me after that, and a lot of times I say, well, you really got to put a good highlight tape together of yourself, but you got to look at what coaches are looking at. And that is, don't fill it up with all offense. Show that you can make plays. Show that you understand the game. Show that you can play defense. Show that you can get on the floor and get that loose ball. Hey, I can rebound. As we talked earlier, I can get into the trenches. And sometimes I think we get hurt now, because I think our league is watered down a lot, that we don't have because these players got to look at, and I tell them a lot of times, this is not to be in any way saying something that's not politically correct, but you can't, your competition are Americans for jobs. And you look at how many universities and how many great players there are. And I've sent videotapes for coaches overseas, and all of a sudden, if a guy puts a videotape together and he's basically playing against teams that are majority made up of white players, hey, they don't want to see that. They want to see what you can do competing against, a lot of times, it's black athletic players. Not that, but that's just the way it is. And I would say, hey, you find the best teams. You find the best teams in Canada West. Don't take some video from a team that may have won 3 games and lost 13, whatever. Find those tough games, and then back it up with, actual game tape. Because let's face it, we've never seen the highlight tape where a shot doesn't go in. They all go in,
Exactly, they all go in. I do have, I'm going to add one more question. I want to know, you talked a little bit about Ken Shields, and you talked a little bit about other great teams in the Canada West. Who were the people that got you excited to play every day?
Oh, definitely, Victoria, Alberta, Calgary. And keep in mind, I coached when we basically had Great Plains Athletic Conference was 5 teams. When you look in the 80s and 90s, many times we had 2 teams go on to the national championship. Winnipeg had strong teams, and I always kind of give our conference credit that the tougher your conference is, the better it's going to prepare you for the national championships. And then you had Canada West at that time. Calgary always had good teams. Alberta, definitely UVic, UBC. Now things are changing quite a bit. I know I talked to Don Horwood right before he retired back, probably been 10, 12 years ago. And he says, hey, I'm done. He said, I used to could go into British Columbia and recruit some very good players from BC. But now what happens, we got so many colleges and universities. This Canada West is 17 teams right now. So I don't think we have the quality of teams that we had years ago. And a lot of it is that somebody that maybe UBC or Vic could get from enter, like a J.D. Jackson, who went and played at UBC today, maybe playing somewhere like at Thompson Rivers, or maybe playing for UBCO. Maybe he decided to stay in that area. And but now you see what's happened. Some of these coaches has had to broaden out, and you look at Barnaby, for example, at Alberta. Now he has players from Quebec. He has players from Toronto. One of Jude Kelly, one of my former players, Andre Kelly, is plays at University of Alberta. So they, and as I mentioned to you earlier, with that conference, you play so many games to eliminate 5 teams that may have combined 10 wins, and I'd like to see it go back to a regional format. And I think that with this COVID-19, this is what they're talking about for January, that there'll be like the Great Plains Conference, which will be Saskatchewan, Regina, Brandon, Winnipeg, and Manitoba. And they'll play like a 16-game schedule with some type of playoff. And now they're going to be playing each other 2 games at home and 2 on the road. Because to be honest with you, I don't think we've lost that. We've lost that excitement of that rivalry, those close games, and that, fans against fans sort of thing, because UBCO comes in, or Thompson Rivers or Northern BC, doesn't mean anything to our fans. And I think, but how they ever going to resolve that, and I think probably you've got UBC and maybe some of the bigger schools in British Columbia, because that's where you got a lot more schools playing, like Thompson Rivers, UBCO, Fraser Valley, etc. And I think that they don't want to relegate themselves to just playing them on a regional thing, because they'd probably rather play the Winnipegs, the Manitoba, Brandon, the Calgary, and Lethbridge. So, but I know this past year.
I think one thing that could help too is if we actually got some more money for these guys to play with. You know what I mean? Like we need to spend some money on some of these players.
Yeah, well, that's always been an issue. I know it's changed somewhat. When I finished coaching, the max that you could help one was $1,500, but they had to be with you a year before they qualified to get that. Then Alberta found a loophole around that, because all of a sudden they had some good teams in the 90s, but they had kids coming in, and after their first year was over, as soon as this academic year was over, then they I forgot what they called it, but they gave them the money at that time. Meanwhile, everybody else was basically wasn't given any help until they started in their next year. And but now it's up to tuition and fees. And a lot of that is the fact that, you got a team like, say, Trinity Western, where it's a lot more expensive to go to school than it is somewhere else. And Brandon here, I know our university president and vice president, which is a huge plus for Brandon right now. They started in about 2010. I wish I'd had it around when I was coaching, but they waive international fees. So for volleyball players, women's basketball and men's basketball, and that's a huge advantage, because a lot of schools I don't think have that. And then you got a situation, you got Carlton now that's winning all the championships. And actually, I think it's time that we need a startup date in university basketball. They don't have one there. They have these big basketball academies. They bring their players. They practice all summer. They work. They're required to get up 400 or 500 shots, 3-point shots a day. They bring these NCAA schools in August, early September, and they do well against them because they've been doing it. Well, can Brandon University do that? Could Regina do that? Hey, you can't do that. And I think it's going to come to a point where I think they really I don't think it's good for Canadian university basketball right now that you got one team that's winning all these championships. Now, if I was coaching, I'd say differently. And I tell people, when you look at the 90s of university basketball, you had like 8 different teams. And I'm going to go through those quickly with you. 1990, Concordia wins. 1991, Brock wins. 1992, Western wins. 93, St. Francis wins. Alberta wins in 94, 95. 96, Brandon wins. 97, Victoria wins. 98, Bishops wins. And 1999, St. Mary wins. We had all these different teams. And that was a great decade of basketball because there was so much competition. Now, since the early 2000s, I don't know, in the last 20 years, I think you'd probably know better than me. Carlton's won 16, 17 national championships. But they have a unique advantage there. You know?
Absolutely. Jerry, give me one quick second. I'm sorry. Just give me one second.
So it's probably the longest interview you've done.
And it is. And you know what? With that, we're going to end it. I mean, you've been outstanding. I think some of your stories needed to be shared with people. I think it's very important that people get a history lesson of what has happened before. And you've given us that today. So I want to say thank you so much for that, Jerry, and everything you've done.
I know. I tell people, you know, the thing about, you know, we're not like it, the U.S. And when I retired, I had over 734 wins. And the young people around here now, do they know who Jerry Hemmings is? There's people across Canada. And I tell my wife, boy, if I want to get my ego stroke, I got to do one of two things. I got to either go to a nursing home, or I either got to go down to the Brandon Clinic where all the other older people are coming, you know, because they remember you.
Yeah.
So I appreciate
outstanding, and I want to get this story out, and I want people to hear it because it's been great. And I want to say thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you.